More than 1 million New Yorkers cast their ballots early in today's presidential election.
Yeah, the debut of early voting in New York wasn't as smooth as it could have been due to long lines and a shortage of polling places. With 4 million registered voters in New York who will head to the polls today, can we expect similar questions? There are a lot of questions at that. So Susan Lerner, she's the executive director of the voter advocacy group Common Cause New York, joining us live this morning with some helpful information to make sure our votes get counted. Good morning to you, Susan. Thanks for being with us once again this morning on this election morning.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Susan, let's get to it. This was the first presidential election in New York, early voting, but the process was plagued by long lines, as we saw earlier. There were 1,200 polling sites open today. Do you expect to see similar problems? We're already seeing some issues with internet connections and places opening late.
So, yes, in any human system with over 1,200 units, you're going to see some problems. There are some polling places that when our election protection volunteers got there at 6 o'clock, there were already several hundred people online. When you open a polling place with 500 people online, it's going to be very hard to catch up. So the voter enthusiasm remains high, and people should definitely be patient when they decide to go to their polling place. We like to recommend to people, if you can, you have the flexibility, try to go in the middle of the day. The busiest times are usually the morning and the early evening through the end of the polling, which is starts at 6 a.m., ends at 9. So if you have flexibility and you can go at 1 or 2, chances are it might be less of a wait.
Susan, what kind of ramifications are there? We saw the site in Bed-Stuy. It opened close to 30 minutes late. There are people who got in line early because, say, they have to go to work or whatnot, and they can't stay and wait for, hours and hours. For those folks who perhaps maybe some of them had to get out of line and leave, what can be done about that, and what is being done about that?
So in that situation, as I said, the best thing to do, if you can't wait then, is to come back later in the day. And voters should be aware, if you're online at your polling place at 9 p.m., they cannot kick you out.
Right.
You will get to vote. So if you have a time crunch and you have to leave, come back at the end and know that however long it takes, and hopefully not super long, you will get to vote at the end of the day.
Susan, I want to ask you about the Board of Elections, because they've been notoriously bad about communicating with voters, even us in the media, about polling site changes. So for a voter who is heading to a site that may not be open, has those long wait times like Betty is talking about, is there another option today for them to cast their ballot?
So the only other option is if they have already requested their absentee ballot and they have it in hand. You can fill it out and you can drop it off at any polling place in New York City. So if you are a voter whose polling place first thing in the morning is really backed up and you have your absentee ballot as a backstop, you can take it with you to work, you can fill it out, and you can drop it off at a convenient polling place anywhere in the city. But to vote in person, it must be at your assigned polling.
Well, Susan, I think what I was trying to get to with that is if folks did have to get out of line because they have to go to work and they cannot come back at a later time, you're going to have folks who are feeling like they've been disenfranchised because they showed up when they were supposed to show up, or even earlier than that, but because of technical glitches and other issues, which we've known what Election Day was going to be well ahead of time, so these things should have been worked out, they are going to be upset. So how do you resolve that or combat it?
Well, we combat it the way the Board of Elections does, which is working very directly with the board to, as I said, with human systems, this number statistically, it's never going to be perfect, to identify problems and fix them very promptly. The board has been responsive in that way. But what you're talking about is one of the reasons why we advocated for early voting. So that fewer people were faced with that situation where unfortunately something goes wrong on election day and they have a time crunch and they can't stay. That's why early voting has been so useful for over 1 million New York City voters.
I mean, there was that scathing report by the Department of Investigations a couple of years ago about the Board of Elections. Just so you know, one of our producers is telling me right now that there's a Twitter handle called New York City Votes, which is keeping a close eye on some issues right here. We're hearing that there were poll workers at the Javits Center that can't be redeployed because of wireless problems to get them to other places. So there are issues that are being dealt with this morning. Susan, thank you for your time this morning. If you If you at home are hearing of any issues on the voter online, if you have an issue, let us know. We want to hear from you as well so we can bring it to your attention and we can raise it with the